Good morning, dear friends. Thank you for joining us today. It is the 20th of Adar Sheni, Adar Beis, March 23rd, if you could believe it. We're less than a month away from Pesach. We are less than a week past Purim. And we're here to study the entire Talmud, one page, one line, maybe a few letters at a time. Presently, Maseches Shabbos, Perek Arba Asar, chapter 14, 109a. And I'm going to go with the minimalistic backdrop. We spent our time yesterday talking about Talmudic era remedies, but not just to explore the medicinal value of certain herbs and treatments, but as it intersects with the laws of Shabbos. If we had to give a major oversimplification, the rule is pikuach nefesh, you could do anything. But beyond that, any medical procedure, remedy, or medication, which is exclusively used for medicinal healing purposes, is prohibited on Shabbos. The origin behind it, the reason behind it is lest we come to believe that the crushing, the pulverizing of the stuff, that ingredients of medication is permitted on Shabbos, and it certainly is not. And so we talk about all different kinds of remedies. Are they obviously healing? Are they also used for other purposes? So, for example, the salve on the eye, can you place it? Well, did you do it before Shabbos? Was there a hecker? And then in the last few minutes of the shir, which we're not going to rehash really, but I just wanted to to refresh our memory. We had a Gemara that had two very different interpretations. Either the Gemara discussed the permissibility of basting, seasoning, oil, eggs over a roasted dish when Shabbos has already begun. It's not entirely hot, but it's hot enough. Does it have the appearance of makeh b'patish misaking? Does it have the appearance of the final stage of preparation? And this is Rashi's interpretation, and the Gemara concludes that it is permissible because ultimately you can eat a roast or a roasted dish very perfectly without this last basting process. And we brought an analogy from filtering out certain drinks that are consumed with or without filterization. That was one way of understanding the Gemara. That was Rashi's way of teaching the Gemara. Tosfos quotes Rabbeinu Chananel, who had a very different pshat. We're talking about some kind of melon juice, which was used primarily in a medical capacity, but I guess it was also a drink. And could you filter it? And the Gemara concludes, based on this interpretation, that you may do so because it is equally consumed, or it is just as likely to be consumed without filterization, and therefore the filtering is not a necessary step. I want to sidestep for the moment, although it probably we need to explore, because we didn't really talk about the filtering in the context of filtering. We talked about it in the context of making the food right. Are there times that you're allowed to do boyer or filtering if it's not needed? I want to sidestep it for now, but just to note that question certainly could arise. Today's Gemara, we're going to continue talking about other types of remedies and healing on Shabbos and in general. And let's take a look. Again, two disclaimers. First of all, we don't figure out the entire intricacies and nuance of Shabbos observance based on the Gemara. The Gemara is a necessary first step of a journey, which can then take us through the Shulchan Aruch to more contemporary poskim, Shalot Teshuvot, etc., etc. But the Gemara certainly is the necessary and absolute best place to get the background and to understand the conversations in their origin as the discussion develops. Number two, please don't take medical advice from our Gemara, although it is certainly a fascinating place to get insight into certain medicinal qualities that different stuff has, but we should not be following. This should not take the place of competent medical advice. And so those are two important disclaimers. And I want to welcome Mark, who joins us, even though shortly, sometime today, you'll be representing us in the Holy Land. So it's great to have you on. Let's share.
Every time my brain remembers something, I go throw it in.
Let's share the screen and get started. And for those that are watching the recording, don't worry, we had our daily dose of current events, but now we're ready for the Gemara. So 109A, talking about bathing, dabbing one's injury in wine or oil. I'm sorry. I need to add one more detail. Can we call this salacious? No. We talked about how the wife of Zeiri cooked a dish for Chia bar Ashi. Why is the wife of Zeiri cooking a dish for Chia bar Ashi? Well, maybe they were friends and a friend was over. But it sounds like maybe it's kind of inappropriate. This is a very intimate candlelight dinner between this person's friend's wife. So we could just say that they were having a meal together, and she served both of them, and he wasn't eating, and she asked, "Why aren't you eating?" But I saw in the footnotes of one of the Gemaras that I was looking at that quote from the Gaonim that actually the wife of Zeiri was widowed of Zeiri. Zeiri passed away, and they were remarried, and she remarried Chia Barashi. And so it was actually a husband and wife, and she's asking her new husband why he won't eat the dish that she very properly, confidently, and comfortably prepared for her first husband, her departed husband. And now the conversation could make sense even in that context. So I thought that was interesting, not something that I considered when we learned the Gemara yesterday, but it was brought to my attention, and I wanted to add that to the equation as well. Now let's start our next Gemara about applying or dipping one's wound in wine or vinegar. Amar Mar Ukva, further on the subject of healing, I think we said Mar Ukva was a student who picked up medical expertise from Shmuel. Was Mar Ukva also a physician? No. He was the first of the exilarchs who claimed to say he was an important judge, scholar, student of Shmuel, known for his piety and wealth. He was famous for his discretion and generosity. So he was a big macher and also a student of Shmuel. All right. Mi shenig fa yada, a person that has a boo-boo, person that has a wound on his foot or hand or foot, yada ragloi, soimsa, biyayin, he is allowed to dip his foot in wine, and he doesn't have to worry about a Shabbos desecration. I'm not certain you can serve that wine afterwards, but let's take a look at Rashi. Shenigpa, shenichshala v'laksa. Person tripped. He had an injury. Lashon pentigoif, dam magifasa. So we're talking about a wound with blood. So tzoim sabiyayin, Rashi says you can dip it in wine. L'shachech hadam, and this is going to cause the blood to stop bleeding, to create a scab. Anyone in background in medicine or EMS, have you ever used wine to stop bleeding?
Have the alcohol content.
So you're saying maybe
But
the
certainly
alcohol
burn.
with what with wine? But you're right. Maybe there is something in it. Not maybe. It's apparently at least the wine they had that effect. So he was then asked a question, or the question was asked of the Chazal. We have a teaching of Mar Ukva that talks about the permissibility of dipping one's injury in wine. Why is it not considered a problem on Shabbos? I suppose because people would bathe and cleanse even if there was no injury in wine, as we mentioned. Again, not anymore, but in the time of the Gemara, that may have been a practice that was prevalent enough that it would not be perceived as exclusively a medical treatment. But what about vinegar? The Chazal asked, the sages of the Gemara asked, what about vinegar? Amar Rav Hillel of Rav Ashi. So Rav Hillel tells Rav Ashi, Yavina Beger of Kana, when we were in the company of Rav Kana, when we were in his home, Amri Chalallah, he told us that you're not allowed to dip an injury in vinegar. Why not? Because regular folks do not dip or wash with vinegar. And so it is obvious that doing so is for the purposes of healing. So Oh, I'm sorry. I may have explained this Gemara wrong. The next Gemara. All right, based on the next Rashi, we may want to revisit what I just explained. So anyways, Mar Ukva says you're allowed to dip it in wine. What about vinegar? So Rav Hillel says, I heard from a Kana that you're not allowed to use vinegar. Amarava Rabatat, Hani Bnei Mechuzah, the folks that live in the city of Mechuzah, Kivan de Mefanki, being that they are very delicate, Kivan de Mefanki, Afilu Chamra Nami Masile. So for them, because they're very delicate, even wine is effective in sudarizing. Is that the word?
Rabbi,
Yes.
we explain the prohibition for healing on Shabbos because we don't want to allow people to think that crushing and preparation of all kinds of mixtures is allowed. But in this case, there is no crushing, it's just vinegar. So how is that gets under the prohibition? What is the explanation for not using vinegar for healing in this case?
No, so it's a gzeira. It's a rabbinic decree. They said we're not going to allow any medical treatments or remedies, because once a person or people are permitted to do medical, non-essential, non-life-saving medical treatment, people will assume that all facets of medicine is permissible, and that would lead to the desecration of Shabbos and the preparation of medicines. And it would appear that most medicines back then, and perhaps today, and we have pharmacists here who can confirm or deny, much of the ancient world, medicine included pulverizing and smashing and crushing different ingredients in a method that is prohibited on Shabbos. And so being that the predominant, most of medicine was that, so the Chazal prohibited even other types of remedies because of the potential for leading to the desecration of Shabbos. So that is the reason. So although vinegar and wine is certainly not prohibited, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with playing with vinegar or splashing oneself with vinegar or wine. It's not, I mean, it might not be a great idea, but so based on a reading of this Rashi, it sounds like Rava is saying the reason why you could use wine is because wine is not really effective. But people in Bnei Mechuzah are very delicate, so even the slightest, what's the word, acidity or alcohol would cause their injury to stop, would cause the wound to be healed. Art Scroll here translates that we're talking Tzom Sabiyayin means not just the blood, but brings down swelling. So I guess the more delicate you are, the lighter or slightest dosage could be effective. And so therefore, in Mechuzah, they even shouldn't use wine, which we would infer the reason why Mar Ukva says you can use wine is because wine is typically not effective. That's what it sounds like. All right, let's see another story on the same subject of healing. Ravina, Ikla Levei Ravashi. Ravina went to the house of Ravashi. Chazia, just in time to notice a terrible accident. The Dricha Lechamra Agaba de Kare. He notices that a donkey stepped on Ravashi's foot. Rashi, Chamor Dorach Loi Al Ragloi. The donkey stepped on his foot. And what did Rav Ashi do? Yosef Katsomis Lebechala, he right away ran and dipped his injured foot into vinegar. Amar Lei, so Ravina tells Rav Ashi, I saw that. Do you not agree, Rav Ashi? Great Rav Ashi, do you not agree with the teaching that we just quoted in our Gemara, that one is not permitted to dip an injury into vinegar? Amarle Rav Ashi responded, Gav hayad v'gav haregel shani. When Rav Hillel says a teaching that you're not allowed to dip into vinegar, that was only regarding dipping one's hand. But one's foot, you're allowed to do so. Why? Let's read Rashi. Shemakasoi kosha umesukan. Because an injury of the foot that's more extreme or severe can cause life-threatening, could have life-threatening ramifications. And therefore, what I'm doing is the desecration of Shabbos, but it is to avoid a devastating, possibly life-threatening injury. What's so extreme about the top of the foot?
Circulation in the feet is less than the hands.
So it's more vulnerable, you're saying, or it's
Diabetics have to be very careful with their toes, with nail clipping.
interesting. Okay, so maybe that's it. The foot has a certain vulnerability, and therefore, I'm sorry, I read this wrong. I'm like gava yad v'gava shiny regel. Regel shiny. I'm sorry, I miss the extremities. The hand and the foot is more vulnerable both than other types of injuries. So Rav Ashi says, I misspoke. When Rav Hillel taught that you're not allowed to apply vinegar to a wound, he was not talking about an injury of the hand or the foot, which have a greater vulnerability, and therefore one should treat it with the vinegar, even though there is a halachic problem. Interesting.
Right.
Let's see how the Shulchan Aruch. Hold on, just to take a look in this code of Jewish law. If a person gets a wound on their hand or foot, you could submerge your hand in wine to cause the blood to stop, but not vinegar. Why? Because vinegar is very strong and it really can be a health remedy. So interestingly, this is brought down in the code of Jewish law, and the Rambam as well brings this down, halacha lemaisa. Here, I mean, and this is a long text, but I just want to show you if it'll be helpful. This is the Torah, which is a halachic work that precedes the Shulchan Aruch. Kol refuah asura. Professor, I know I said this outside, but just to show you, kol refuah asura. Healing is prohibited b'Shabbos. Lest you come to grind, to crush ingredients of medicine. If it's dangerous, you're allowed to. Any internal injury, you're allowed to desecrate Shabbos. But if you know that you don't need to if you know that it's not life-threatening, you don't need to desecrate Shabbos. A hand or foot injury, you can desecrate Shabbos. But generally, otherwise, you shouldn't do it unless the doctor says specifically so. Interestingly enough, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't seem to embrace the teaching of Rav Ashi the way the Torah does. The Shulchan Aruch says you should not be dipping your hand and foot. So it sounds like the Shulchan Aruch is of the position that it is not life-threatening. The hand, an injury of the hand or foot is not necessarily automatically life-threatening. Why does he pass in that way? Because there's another story. There's another version of this very story. Maybe he saw him dipping his injured foot in wine. Don't you believe the teaching that says that people that are very delicate are not allowed to dip even in wine? And I guess Rav Ashi would be classified as Umar Nami Homefanik, and we know the master Rav Ashi was a great Torah scholar and royal character, and therefore he was also very delicate. Hands and foot are different. Amar Rav Ada Bar Mas Amar Rav Gavayad v'gavaregel hareihin kemaka shel cholol. The hand and the foot, they are like a mortal wound. Mechalelin aleim as a Shabbos. So here we have the same idea, but much more explicit. The hand or foot are extreme, severe, urgent injuries.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I don't know how they measured their vinegar in those days, but the vinegar has a very, very strong acid in it. It's called acetic acid.
Okay.
And sometimes if that is too strong, it'll irritate the tissue inside the open wound and make it even worse than it should be.
We use it to remove warts in a high concentration.
Interesting. Well, apparently, whatever vinegar we're talking about is a vinegar that did heal, or that's what it sounds like. And so that's the conclusion of a little segment in the Gemara about dipping wine in vinegar. Vinegar seems to be more effective because it is so strong and sharp. Wine less so, or maybe because people will also use wine for general kinds of cleansing. All right, let's see the next Gemara, which is now going to talk about different other kinds of washes and bathing that have medical value. Remember, we already talked about dipping in Mei Sedoim in the Dead Sea, but we're now going to address this more comprehensively, starting with a brisa. Roy chatzin b'mei gerar. One is permitted to wash in the gerar waters. Where are mei gerar? Let's see. B'mei hachamson, you're also allowed to bathe in the waters of chamoson. B'mei asya, ub'mei tiveria. One may bathe on Shabbos. One may bathe in the therapeutic hot springs in these following bodies of water: Mei Gror, Mei Chamson, Mei Asya, Mei Tveria. I think sometimes the Mei Tveria are called Chamei Tveria. They're springs in the Galilee. But one may not bathe in the Great Sea or the ocean. Well, there's a machlokes if it means the ocean or if it means the Mediterranean Sea. Nor may one bathe in water that was used to soak flax. Nor may one soak and bathe in the Dead Sea. Rashi, what's the chiddush that you're allowed to bathe in the waters of Gerar? Although their water is somewhat salty, people bathe in it in weekdays for purposes of hygiene. And it's not evident that it is being done now simply and entirely for the purposes of healing. Point out, most of these waters, Mei Gror, Mei Chamsa, Mei Asya, Mei Tveria, is in Israel. Gror we know is in Israel, right? It's mentioned in the story of the interactions of Abraham and Yitzchak, Avimelech. Chamson apparently is also in the region of the Galilee. I'm not sure about exactly where Asya is.
Rabbi, why are we concerned? If you're there just to bathe, so that's something shalot tzricha. What are we worried about? What other people are doing in that?
We are worried about people bathing well, here's what this brisa is teaching us. If what you're doing is possibly mundane and not for healing purposes, it might, according to this brisa, be permissible. But areas that a person only bathes for the remedy, for the medical component, this brisa would assert one cannot do so. That, let's see Rashi. This is because Rashi is going to explain his theory of this brisa. You soak flax. The ein derech rechitza v'hen. People do not bathe in these waters. Ella lerefua. Demasu. The water is gross, and you don't go in there for pleasure. You might go in there for medical purposes. And similarly, the Dead Sea in the time of the Gemara, the Maliach Tuva, which is super salty. A person would only go in there for the medical benefits and not for cleansing. So if some of these waters, it is obvious that you're doing it for the health benefit. Other waters, it could also be done for purposes of bathing. Now you may recall, because we talked briefly about the Yam HaGadol way back when in our Gemara, where we talked more broadly about swimming, which swimming is prohibited. And you may recall, we talked, Alan, I remember we were involved in talking about contrasting mikvah, swimming, and bathing. But for the purposes of this moment, let's differentiate between them. And let's say that it's obvious that swimming l'schot is not okay, but perhaps just lounging or bathing might be okay for the purposes of this discussion. But if it is entirely for medical reasons, one may not do so. So what is the Yam HaGadol? So when we learned the Gemara last time, we talked about and I just alluded to a moment ago, it may either mean Dafka, the Mediterranean, or it can mean all of the oceans. And
But once it's in the Mediterranean, it could be.
Let's see the Gemara's analysis, as Rashi alerts us to why one may or may not bathe in the Yam HaGadol, to figure out if you're allowed to bathe in the Yam HaGadol, and then maybe we'll be able to figure out what it means in this context. So let's hold the question, but note it real fast. All right, we'll revisit this Tosfos Bli Neder in a moment. Here, Remino, the Gemara has a conflicting or a contradictory brisa, which says as follows: Roi chatzin b'mei Tiveria v'yam hagadol, that you are allowed to bathe in the springs of Tiveria and the sea, but not in the waters of flax and not in the Dead Sea. Kasha Yam HaGadol Yam HaGadol. So we have a contradiction between the two brises. If you may or may not bathe in what we are calling the Yam HaGadol, can you or can you not? Amar Rabbi Yochanan Kasha. There is not really a contradiction, the two brises, one that says you can and one that says you cannot go into the Yam HaGadol. Rabbi Meir, one brise is the opinion of Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Yehuda, and the other is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Let's read Rashi. The brise that permits swimming in the Yam HaGadol. Rabbi Meir he did mashri kol hayamim ki hadadi v'loy maflik ben Yam HaGadol l'shar hayamim. Rabbi Meir, who says Yam HaGadol, he treats all seas halachically the same. This is Rashi's explanation. Rabbi Yehuda, and the one that says that you may not bathe, the Tani ein roi chatzin, Rabbi Yehuda he the maflik ben Yam HaGadol l'shar yamim. This would be the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, the Tanan. So we have another brisa that's going to talk about the big bodies of water, and we're going to see the viewpoint of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, and then we can try to figure out what's going on. The Tanan, a Mishnah, Kol hayamim kemikva. All waters, all oceans are have the halachic rules of a mikvah. Shenemar or the mikveh hamayim karayamim. In Bereshis, in the description of the bodies of water, it says, the mikveh mayim, the mikvahs of water, he called seas. Divi Rabbi Meir, this is the opinion of Rabbi Meir, that says all oceans have the same halach. Rabbi Yehuda says no. Yam Hagadol Kamikva. The Yam Hagadol has the laws of a mikvah, but not other seas. And the only reason why it says mikvah mam kara yamim is to tell us that there are many different kinds of seas. Rabbi Yossi adds, hold on, I'm going through this fast, and then we'll discuss more at length. All seas can give purity, can purify, even though the water is moving, unlike a mikvah, which needs to be entirely stational. And it doesn't work, this ocean, for a zavu that needs to have a special purification in a spring. But whenever you need actually a fresh water spring, then the ocean doesn't work. So, what are we saying? What is the Gemara saying? So our Gemara wants to figure out why there might be two brises that treat oceans differently, or Yam HaGadol differently. One says that you may bathe in the Yam HaGadol, and one says that you may not bathe in the Yam HaGadol. And the Gemara answers, well, simple. We have two different rabbis that have two very divergent perspectives on the sea, and that might explain why there are different opinions regarding bathing on Shabbos. Anyone want to take a stab at explaining how this makes anything make sense?
The Great Sea is the Mediterranean Sea.
So let's read Rashi. Okay, the Great Sea is the Mediterranean Sea, and therefore, if you say it's like all other seas,
except for the Dead Sea.
No. We were asking why one brisa says you can bathe in the Yam HaGadol, and one says you cannot bathe in the Yam HaGadol. So let's see Rashi. I think Rashi explains it. L'chol teres mikvah. All oceans have the law of a mikvah. The ein lehem teres mayim, but they do not have the halachic treatment of a spring. And a mayan, a spring, has special purification abilities. Skipping to the good parts. Rabbi Yehuda loikara kasa mikvah lo Yam HaGadol. The Bei Mishloi Krab B'Maaseh Bereishis. Rabbi Yehuda says only the Yam HaGadol is called a mikvah. V'lo never b'shar yamim. So how does this really how does this make sense of the debate? Hold on. Okay, so here's how I think we'll say it. One is allowed to, at least according to one explanation. We'll see if the Mishnah Berurah agrees. At this point, we're assuming the Yam HaGadol means the Mediterranean, and the assertion is that other seas you can bathe. So if the Yam HaGadol has the same halacha as all other seas, that's what Rabbi Yehuda says. Well, then you can bathe in the Yam HaGadol just like you can bathe in all other seas. Rabbi Yehuda, who treats the Yam HaGadol differently, halachically, will by extension not be able to infer that you could swim in the Yam HaGadol just because you can swim in other seas, and therefore he is inclined to prohibit bathing in the Yam HaGadol. Hey, Rebel?
Isn't it strange that we're talking only about seas when you have the river, the Yarden, right there?
No, because the Yarden is a different discussion. The Yarden has no salt, and from the perspective of our Gemara, it doesn't have the same medical remedy. And a river has other concerns, which we discussed in a previous.
So we presume you could swim in the Jordan?
I didn't say that, but it's a different discussion than this discussion. So I want to try to stay focused on the matter at hand. Then afterwards, we can go revisit the previous Gemara we learned a while back that may address the river. Make sense? So now the Gemara is going to challenge the distinction that we made. So again, let me just explain very briefly. We had two brises, one that says you can bathe in the Yam HaGadol on Shabbos, and one says that you cannot bathe in the Yam HaGadol on Shabbos. And we tried to say that the Machlokes was essentially two brises espousing two different Mishnaic opinions, one Rabbi Meir and one Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda, I believe, is the one that said, Rabbi Meir says, no, Rabbi Meir says that you can swim, that you're allowed to bathe in the Yam HaGadol because it's like all other oceans. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, there's something distinct about the Yam HaGadol, the Mediterranean, that would preclude bathing on Shabbos. The Gemara challenges this. Maskiv lo Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak challenges the assertion of our Gemara. Amor, maybe the whole debate is the pligi linyan tuma v'tara. The debate machlokes only has to do with the capacity to purify. Linyan Shabbos mishamas lu, but since when would Shabbos law draw a distinction between different oceans? Is there a substantively different sodium content in the Mediterranean Sea versus the other seas? So you can't authoritatively tell me that two brises are because they're two different rabbis that had a conversation about Tuma and Tara. To mix Tuma and Tahara and Shabbos is like comparing apples and oranges, which doesn't work, asks the Gemara. Ela Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak lekasha. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, you know what? The distinction is a different one. Ha d'ishtai, ha d'lai ishtai. The text that says you can bathe is talking about that you were hanging out for a long time. And a person that's soaking in the Yam HaGadol, it's for medical, medicinal purposes, it's prohibited. But if you jump in, you rinse off and wash out, well, then that looks like you're just cleaning yourself, and that might not be prohibited on Shabbos. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak has a new way to understand two brises. The one that says you can't go means you can't sit there all day, which then it's clearly for health reasons. But the one that says you can is talking about that you just jump in, rinse off, and come out. So your behavior makes it appear to be identical to a person that is rinsing off. Why? I should have clarified one more thing. What's wrong with going into the bodies of water that Bryce has mentioned? So Rashi, what I've been saying is, I believe Rashi is in Pshat, which is that the sodium content is associated with healing, and therefore something that's for healing purposes, if it's clearly for healing, it's prohibited. But if it could also be for other reasons, it would be permitted. The Rambam has an entirely different way of learning this whole Gemara. He says it has nothing to do with healing. It has to do with creating discomfort. And therefore, even if you're not doing it for health purposes, but no matter the reason, if you're doing it, if what you're doing is going to cause you tsar, you're not allowed to trigger tsar on Yontif. On Shabbos. We could argue, we could debate now. And that might explain why Sephardic Jews are particularly machmir to not go into a hot mikvah on Shabbos, because the Rambam, I'm sorry, if I'm not mistaken, takes a much more strict position about bathing in hot water or dunking in hot water on Shabbos. I know, you're going to tell me, since when is it uncomfortable? It's super comfortable. I hear you. But that's the position the Rambam needs to take on this matter. Let's see if we can pull up that Rambam. I'm not sure if we can.
Isn't bathing in a mikvah almost the same as in a sukkah?
I'm sorry?
Isn't the reason for bathing in a mikvah, it should be this, they claim that it's the same as being in a sukkah. You're surrounded by...
Yeah, you're talking about the mystical explanation.
The mystical, yeah.
All right, we'll find that Rambam later. So this is the distinction drawn by Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. I should note we just turned to page 109b. So the Gemara asks, "B'mai u came to the libus raisa the lo yishtoi." How do you know that the later brisa, the brisa that says you're allowed to go in, is because you're not hanging out over there? Either lo yishtoi, if you're not hanging out in the water, then afilu b'mei even in water that's not pleasant, one should also be allowed to bathe, because jumping in and coming out would make it evident that you're not doing it for healing. The Gemara continues the Tanya. Another brayso that says you're allowed to bathe in those hot springs of Tiberias, and you're allowed to bathe in flax water. And in the Dead Sea, although he has wounds, and so everyone that sees those wounds says, "Wow, of course, jumping into the water for the remedy of it." Why is it permissible? We have another brisa which clarifies that you're even allowed to go into the places that we typically say are prohibited if you just jump in and come out, because Rashi explains, when you jump into those waters, the appearance is that you're not doing it for healing, you're just doing it to cool off, and therefore it's not evident that what you're doing is for medical purposes. So again, let me just explain what happened. We have two brises. One brisa that says you can go into the Yam HaGadol, and one that says you can't go into the Yam HaGadol. We gave one answer, which is one rabbi says you're not allowed to, and that's one brisa. One says you may, and that's the other brisa. The Gemara rejects that because the two brises that were introduced are apples, and here is oranges. That was ritual purity, and here we're talking about Shabbos and healing. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak therefore proposes the distinction is not the substance of the ocean. We're not taking a microscope and looking at the degree of sodium. We're looking at what you do in the water. The brisa that says you can go in says you go in real fast, so it doesn't look like you're soaking in it, you're just rinsing in it. And the brisa that says you're not allowed to is talking about you're not allowed to bathe or soak. The Gemara challenges that, because in truth, all of the brisas that say that you can or cannot go in must be talking about that you stay for a prolonged period of time, because there's another brisa that seems to indicate that a fast in and out kind of trip to any of these bodies of water would be permissible. And this question causes us to now present a third way to distinguish between the two brisas, one that says you can go into the Yam HaGadol, one that says you can't go to the Yam HaGadol. Now we're going to say that there are different beaches in the Yam HaGadol. Yam HaGadol Lekasha. There's not a problem, not a contradiction between the two brisas. Why? There are areas that the water is nice and clean and refreshing. And Rashi says, this is a kind of beach that people always want to go there, lirichitza, to clean off, to rinse off, she'ena l'refua, and it's not only done for healing. But there are areas in the Yam HaGadol that are pretty icky. What does royim mean? What makes the water good or bad? I don't know. I see some places mention that maybe it's extra salty, and so it's not pleasant to go in, but you'll go in anyways for the medical purposes. And so that is how we would, this is a third way to resolve the contradiction between you saying you can and cannot go into the Yam HaGadol. If the water is pleasant and people like to go in there regularly for swimming, that's fine. But if people only go there for medical purposes, then you cannot do so on Shabbos. And then the Gemara continues. We also have one brisa that says you can go into Mei Mishra, flax water. And one says you cannot go into flax water. To make linen, you have to soak flax. And this flax, I guess when it soaks, the water becomes all thick. And I could imagine unpleasant. So the Gemara says, when it says you're allowed to go in Hadesh Ta'i, so when it says you can't go, and we're talking about that you're hanging out in there. No one in their right mind is going to hang out in this gross, thick, gloopy, water. But Hadesh Ta'i. But sometimes you're so hot that you're willing to even jump into murky, unpleasant water for a moment. But to sit in it, that's going to only be because you want to have whatever the medical value is. Rebbe Nachum, are you on? I'm trying to figure out what might be the value. Healing properties of flax.
All right. What do we need? You need converting something?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I heard you from across the room. You need something converted?
When mixed with water, well, suffice it to say, there's a lot of discussion about the medicinal value of flax seed. So we can imagine that's perhaps what the Gemara is talking about. This takes us all the way to the next Mishnah. I now want to run back up to the top of this Gemara. Where we started talking about washing in these waters. Just want to show you the Shulchan Aruch here. Based on our Gemara, based on the third interpretation, the Shulchan Aruch says you're allowed to bathe. You're allowed to hang out in the hot springs of Gerar, Chamson, and Tiberias. And you're also allowed to go into the nice beaches of the Yam HaGadol. Although they have a salt content. Rebero, that's why we're not talking about the Jordan, which is an important question, but it's not a question of the healing properties and the sodium. Because being that folks also not needing the health benefits would swim in them, therefore it is not clear that what you're doing is a malacha. But you cannot go in the less pleasant beaches with Mishra or other kinds of mu'usim, gross waters, because of those ain't derech lirchais from elul refuah. All this that we said that you're not allowed to soak in certain kinds of water, that's to hang out. But if the person is not intending to hang out in them, mutter she'eina nira ela kamekar, the appearance is purely to cool off.
Rabbi, how come they don't mention sulfur springs?
What is a sulfur spring?
It's like the hot springs, but it's got a lot of sulfur in it.
So is that maybe what?
And it's used,
But is that what maybe the springs of Tiberias, or those are different?
I know they have swimming pools at the Dead Sea that have got sulfur. They're called sulfur pools.
So then I imagine what we're describing here are sulfur pools. I may be wrong. Or maybe Mark will help us out. Maybe the sulfur pools is what we're calling the Mayim HaRoyim. It's not pleasant.
I know in Tiberia, the hot springs, I think, have sulfur. And I think even the ones in Florida, I think, have sulfur.
Right. So I think it is synonymous. Here, I just want to show you here. We're looking now in the Mishnah Brura on the Shulchan Aruch. He quotes the Rambam that I was telling you about. You're not allowed to bathe in water that causes, what's the word? Laxatives. The loy betitcha toivim by nor is a person allowed to go in the mud that sometimes people put on. Why? These all cause pain, discomfort. And based on that, you would also not be allowed to drink things that cause a change to your consistency.
They're actually saying it's okay to go in the water then on Shabbos. It's not swim.
So this is a discussion. There's a whole section in the Shulchan Aruch, which is too long for me to flip through over here. Anyways, give me 1 second. Let's just take a look one more thing. Where's the no.
Rabbi,
Yes.
let's finish with a silly question.
No.
What is the status of whatever these waters are when they're frozen, walking on them on Shabbos?
I don't see a reason that you couldn't walk on them. The whole discussion here is about the healing of it. But the real question, and I know that's why you're saying that it's silly, is most likely high sodium content water is not going to freeze. Is that what you're getting at?
No, but these are waters that are in Israel, and does not happen.
Right. I think Rabbi is saying, what about the parallel type bodies? But I don't think that sulfur springs or hot springs freeze.
Yeah.
Nor does the ocean freeze.
Being a Canadian, is walking on frozen water the same as going in the water?
That's an interesting.
Halachically.
That's an interesting question. Bli neder tomorrow. It's 11 o'clock. Bli neder tomorrow. I just want to close off some loose ends and some other halachic questions we've asked. I want to compare and contrast bathing, swimming, soaking, and to see, or just to recap what we've talked about a long while back. And again, just to remind everyone, today's Gemara, we started off with the question of dipping one's injury in wine or vinegar. And then we went on to talk about bathing in a whole bunch of high sodium content pools and swimming things or otherwise meant for healing purposes that and discussing when they may and when they may not be done. We brought a few different theories to contrast between two brises, and we looked in the Shulchan Aruch, and the Shulchan Aruch seems to take the position that even the areas that one is not allowed to swim, that would be for a prolonged period of time and not for a short period of time, and also a distinction between nice water and gross water. But again, tomorrow I want to just tie all this loose ends together, and we'll go to Menachem. You were saying something?
Yeah, does Tchum Shabbos count on frozen lake?
Good question. I don't see why not, but I would have to review that before giving you a psak. All right, folks, thank you all. I hope to see everybody tomorrow. Gesundheit. For those that are interested in our meditation course, we're resuming lesson 4 tonight at 7 p.m. and talk about, well, you'll see. We talk in conventional meditation about being present, and we'll talk about where Jewish meditational principles agree and how they might differ. So that's at 7 o'clock. If you're interested in joining, please shoot me a text or email. Have a wonderful day.